In ancient Rome, wearing the wrong color, crying too loudly at a funeral, or wandering at night could land you in serious legal trouble. Purple? Only emperors could touch it. Too much grief? Crowd control laws. Dinner parties? Regulated or risk chaos. Rome didn't do this to be cruel. It did it to survive. Stay with me, and I'll show you how even the tiniest choices could make or break an empire. Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a quiet walk into ancient Rome, a place where you could control half the known world, yet still get in trouble for wearing the wrong color, crying too loudly at a funeral, or being outside at night while looking a little too alive. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy being here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. In ancient Rome, clothing wasn't about self-expression. It wasn't about personality, mood, or finding yourself. Clothes were about sending one clear message: how much legal trouble you could cause. Fashion wasn't art. It was a warning system. And the loudest warning of all was purple dye was so expensive it almost sounds like a joke. It came from tiny sea snails, thousands of them, each producing only a drop of color before dying in the process. The work took forever, smelled terrible, and depended on long trade routes across the Mediterranean. Naturally, Rome decided this color needed strict rules. Only emperors, senators, and high officials were allowed to wear large amounts of purple. A fully purple toga was the ancient version of flashing a sign that said, "I have authority, you do not." It saved time, no debates, no arguments, no awkward misunderstanding. You saw the toga and immediately thought, prison speed run outfit. To us, that sounds dramatic. To Romans, it was practical. Rome was massive, crowded, and tense. There were no uniforms, no ID cards, no badges to explain who mattered. Visual clarity was essential. Purple handled that job perfectly. It also prevented another problem: rich people competing way too hard. Romans loved status, sometimes too much. If purple hadn't been restricted, wealthy elites would have ruined themselves trying to outdo one another at dinner parties. Rome already knew where aggressive elite competition led: collapse. So limiting purple was basically Rome saying, please stop before this gets stupid. Breaking the rule was serious. Wearing purple without permission was treated as impersonating authority. This wasn't a fashion mistake. It was identity fraud with sandals. Rome didn't ban the color out of pettiness. It banned it because Romans understood something deeply important. Clear hierarchy prevents arguments. Arguments turn into violence, destroys empires. And if all of that could be avoided by telling most people, no, you can't wear the fancy snail color, Rome considered that a fair deal. Grief in ancient Rome was allowed, uncontrolled grief was not. Romans didn't fear emotion. They feared what emotion could turn into. They knew from experience that public sorrow spreads fast. One person cries, 10 join in. 10 people wail, a crowd gathers, and Rome, someone starts preparing for a riot. So grief was regulated. Professional mourners existed. People paid to cry, scream, pull their hair, and perform sorrow at funerals. And yes, even they had rules. How loud they could be, how long they could mourn, how dramatic they were allowed to get, because nothing unsettles a city faster than hired grief performers screaming in the streets. Women especially were forbidden from excessive public mourning, loud wailing, dramatic collapses, or self-harm gestures, not because Rome hated women, but because these displays drew attention, turned into crowds, crowds turned into chaos. Rome didn't care who caused unrest. It cared that unrest happened at all. This wasn't about suppressing grief. Romans mourned privately, at home, with family. They cried, they remembered, they honored their dead. They just weren't allowed to turn grief into a public spectacle that could spark political tension. Funerals were emotional events, were dangerous in a city already full of rumors, rivalries, and ambition. There was also a class issue. Point 5, rich families could afford huge, dramatic funerals. Poor families couldn't. If grief became competitive, louder cries, bigger processions, more spectacle, funerals would turn into status contests. And Rome had learned the hard way. When status becomes a competition, stability disappears. Rome had already learned a hard lesson. When the elite compete in public, someone usually ends up dead, and it's often the republic itself. So mourning was limited. Think of it as emotional crowd control. The Romans understood something deeply human. Feelings spread, anger spreads, fear spreads, grief spreads, and once emotions spread, laws stop working. From Rome's point of view, letting people mourn without limits was like allowing open flames inside a grain warehouse. It wasn't cruel to control it. It was preventative. Point 5. Rome didn't regulate grief because it lacked compassion. It did it because it knew something modern society still struggled to admit. Uncontrolled emotion doesn't stay personal for long. It turns political. Emotion can burn an empire faster than any invading army. In ancient Rome, even dinner was never just dinner. A meal was politics, performance, and psychological warfare, sometimes served on silver plates. And because Rome was Rome, it decided that if people were going to show off at the table, there needed to be rules, strict ones. These were called sumptuary laws. They controlled how much food you could serve, how many guests you could invite, and even which ingredients were allowed. Not because Romans hated pleasure, but because they had learned a dangerous truth. Rich people cannot be trusted to stop flexing on their own. Left unchecked, elite Romans competed through banquets the same way influencers compete today. Bigger spreads, rarer foods, more exotic imports, louder displays of "look how well I'm doing." This wasn't harmless fun. It destroyed families. Senators bankrupted themselves trying to keep up appearances, then tried to recover by bribery, corruption, and gently destabilizing the state. Point 5. Rome had seen this story before. It didn't like the ending, so the government stepped in and said, "You may host a dinner, but it will be a reasonable dinner." There were limits on meat, luxury foods, and extravagance, especially during certain times of the year. Yes, Rome literally told people to relax with the peacock tongues. This wasn't about protecting poor people from envy. It was about protecting the state from elite stupidity. When powerful families competed socially, alliances broke, debts piled up, and politics turned toxic. Rome knew the fastest way to destroy a republic was to let its elite spiral into status addiction. There was also a moral angle, at least by Roman standards. Excess luxury was seen as weakening discipline. Point 5. Soft men made bad leaders, and nothing screamed soft like needing 7 courses just to feel important. Of course, Romans hated these laws. They complained nonstop. They found loopholes. They renamed foods. They hosted dinners that were technically legal but absolutely against the spirit of the law. Rome passed new rules. The rich ignored them again. This dance went on for a century, but the goal never changed. Stop turning dinner into a political arms race. So yes, Rome limited what you could eat at your own party, not because it hated pleasure, but because it knew that when wealth competes without limits, collapse is only a matter of time. And Rome preferred boring dinners to civil war. Now here's the rule that makes modern readers stop, close the book, and stare at the wall. In Roman society, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held extreme legal power over his family, and when we say family, we mean everyone: adult sons, daughter, grandchildren, slaves, property, money. The entire household universe revolved around him. Grandchildren, slaves, property, money. The entire household universe revolved around him. Yes, even adult sons, married with kids, possibly balding, were still legally under their father's authority. This power included control over finances, marriages, careers, and in early Rome, even life and death decisions. That sounds horrifying. And sometimes it was, but Rome didn't create this system by accident. It came from fear. Fear of disorder. Fear of divided authority. Fear of households turning into tiny civil wars. Rome saw the family as a miniature state, and in Roman thinking, every state needed one ruler, not a committee, not a group chat, one authority whose word ended arguments instantly. Efficiency mattered more than feelings. In a world without constant police presence, without social services, without bureaucracy, the household had to govern itself. The father's power ensured responsibility flowed upward. If something went wrong, debt, crime, scandal, Rome knew exactly who to blame. Fairness was optional. Accountability was not. Point 5. Here's the part people usually don't realize. With power came responsibility. 5. The paterfamilias wasn't just the boss of the household. He was legally on the hook for everyone under his roof. Their debts, their crimes, their survival. If your household fell apart, Rome didn't want explanation. In Rome's eyes, you failed. You were a bad leader. This system wasn't built for comfort. It was built to stop rebellion inside the home. It forced unity. Families weren't emotional democracies where everyone voted. They were economic units that had to function no matter what. Rome wasn't trying to create happy families. It was trying to create predictable ones. Over time, this power softened. Open abuse became socially unacceptable. Community pressure mattered, but the legal structure stayed in place because it worked. Roman households were stable. They reliably produced soldiers, workers, heirs, and taxpayers, which honestly was all the state truly cared about. So yes, Roman fathers held terrifying authority, not because Rome loved cruelty, but because Rome feared chaos even more. And when forced to choose between emotional comfort and social stability, Rome picked stability every time and then carved it into law. Ancient Rome is famous for many things: roads, aqueducts, concrete, empire-wide bureaucracy, and yes, public toilets. Communal toilets, no stalls, no privacy. Picture a long stone bench with evenly spaced holes. People sitting side by side, handling very personal business while casually talking. This wasn't a design failure. This was Roman efficiency. And of course, Rome had rules for it. Public latrines weren't places to relax or socialize. They were regulated because sanitation in a city of over 1 million people was a matter of survival. Disease didn't knock politely, it barged in and stayed. So bathroom behavior wasn't private, it was public health. You didn't linger, you didn't splash, you didn't cause a scene. Conversation was fine, but drama was not. Rome wanted order, not commentary, and absolutely no treating the toilet like a stage. Then there was the infamous shared sponge on a stick, rinsed in salt water between uses. Yes, that sponge. Before you panic too hard, remember, Romans truly believed this was clean. Germ theory didn't exist. Salt water felt safe enough, and after a few months in ancient Rome, your standards adjusted very quickly. Rules existed to prevent chaos. If people fought over seats, stayed too long, or turned latrines into social clubs, things backed up. Backups led to filth. Filth led to disease. Disease led to panic. And panic led to unrest. Rome absolutely hated unrest. Heart 7. Once I came to, there was Turia Leibenkais. Ochi was Spore 7. Public toilets forced equality, at least for a moment. Rich and poor sat together. Senators and shopkeepers shared the same stone bench. Rome liked that reminder that no matter your status, everyone used the same systems. It was used for tanning leather, washing clothes, and farming. Stealing waste could actually get you fined. Rome did not waste. To modern ears, Roman toilets sound horrifying. To Romans, they were brilliant, flowing water. Drainage organization rules. Rome didn't care about your comfort. It cared that you didn't die from something preventable. So yes, Rome told people how to behave in the bathroom. Not because it was invasive, but because without rules, even civilization itself starts to stink. And finally, nighttime. In ancient Rome, night was not romantic. It wasn't mysterious. It wasn't for peaceful moonlit walks. Night was when bad ideas clocked in for work. Once the sun went down, Rome changed. Streets were dark, buildings were packed tightly together, fires spread fast, criminals thrived. Political conspiracies love darkness the way mosquitoes love bare skin. So Rome did what it always did when danger appeared. It assumed guilt until daylight proved innocence. Being out at night automatically made you suspicious. Patrols watched the streets. Guards stopped people. And if you didn't have a very good reason to be outside, Rome assumed you were either planning something illegal or already doing it. This wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Most fires started at night from lamps and torches. Most thefts happened when shops were closed. Most assassinations and secret meetings happened under cover of darkness when witnesses were scarce and shadows were helpful. Rome's solution was simple: discourage nighttime movement altogether. Because when the sun went down, the city stopped being predictable, and Rome never trusted unpredictability. If you had to be out at night in Rome, you needed a reason: work, an emergency, official business. Just wandering around to clear your head, not acceptable. Rome didn't believe in taking a walk for your own peace of mind. Night watchmen had real authority, and challenging them was a terrible idea. Rome would rather inconvenience innocent people than let criminals roam free. This wasn't just about control, it was practical. Fires were a constant threat. Rome burned often, sometimes wiping out entire neighborhoods overnight. Limiting who could be out at night made fires less likely and easier to trace when they happened. Even the elites weren't exempted. The wealthy stayed indoors. Darkness didn't discriminate, and neither did Rome. To us today, it might feel oppressive, but to Romans it made sense. The city was too big, too crowded, too unpredictable to trust the night. Nighttime brought chaos, and chaos was Rome's greatest enemy. So yes, nighttime walkers were suspicious, not because Rome hated freedom, but because Rome understood a harsh truth. Most disasters strike quietly, in the dark, and Rome preferred rudeness over surprise. In ancient Rome, suicide wasn't automatically illegal. That might shock you. What was illegal, though, was deciding to die without filling out the proper paperwork first. Rome was many things, but spontaneous self-destruction wasn't one of them. Citizens who wanted to end their lives had to submit a formal request explaining why. Valid reasons included illness, terminal suffering, irreversible disgrace, or loss of honor. I had a bad week, not good enough. To modern ears, this sounds cruel, but to Rome, it was just common sense. Romans weren't just individuals, they were part of a web. Families depended on them. Debts, inheritances, political alliances, they all ran through citizens. A sudden death, especially a suicide, could send ripples of chaos through society. Legal disputes, angry creditors, confused heirs, even violence. Rome feared chaos more than death. That's why many petitions were denied, not to punish, but to protect. Humans make impulsive, terrible choices when overwhelmed, requiring approval, forced reflection. and reflection saved lives. There was also a practical legal reason. Unauthorized suicide meant the state could seize property. Families lost inheritances. Debts remained unpaid. Rome made it clear dying irresponsibly was financially rude. Approved suicides, on the other hand, were handled with dignity. Property stayed safe. Families avoided punishment. Rome preferred sadness with paperwork over chaos without it. There was also a darker reason. Rome depended on its citizens, soldiers, taxpayers, administrators. Letting people opt out freely weakened the system. So suicide was tolerated, but only if it fit Rome's definition of reason. It wasn't personal, it was preventive. Rome asked, will this destabilize everything? If yes, the answer was no. In ancient Rome, what women wore wasn't just personal, it was political. Clothing, jewelry, visible wealth, all carefully regulated by law. How much gold you could wear, how elaborate your outfits could be, how much sparkle was acceptable. Rome counted it all. To us today, it seems controlling. But for Rome, it was damage control. Status competition among elites ran wild, and women's fashion became one of the fastest ways to escalate it. Fancy jewelry, imported fabrics, outrageous hairstyles, all silent battles of wealth and influence. Rome watched and worried. This is how republics die. Laws limiting luxury weren't about modesty, they were about keeping families from bankrupting themselves just to look better at party. Clothing also communicated social order. Married women dressed modestly were seen as stable. Flashy displays suggested independence, which made Rome nervous. Jewelry limits also protected family wealth. Public gold was literally walking money ripe for theft, envy, resentment. Rome preferred wealth discreet, accounted for, taxable. Of course, women pushed back. They layered jewelry, borrowed used hairstyles to exaggerate style. Men complained and admired quietly. Laws were passed and ignored century after century, but the goal stayed the same: control social pressure, keep elite competition from destroying society. Rome didn't fear beauty, it feared the chaos that unchecked beauty could cause. To modernize, gladiators were ancient superstars. Crowds cheered, graffiti celebrated them, fans collected memorabilia. But the law said absolutely not. Gladiators were legally infames, dishonorable people. They lost basic rights, couldn't vote, hold office, or give full testimony in court. Why? Rome hated mixed signals. Gladiators killed for entertainment. Admiring them was fine. Aspiring to be like them. Dangerous. Rome wanted controlled violence. Scheduled, ticketed, contained. The dishonor rule acted as a firewall. You could cheer, but you couldn't rise in society by swinging a sword in the arena. Class played a role too. Many gladiators were slaves, prisoners, or poor. Rewarding them with status could disrupt hierarchy. Even free men who volunteered gave up legal dignity. Fame and money? Yes. Respect under the law? No. This kept young men from abandoning military or civic careers for arena glory. Rome needed soldiers and administrators more than influencers with swords, yet the contradiction remained. Romans adored gladiators. They fantasized about them, gossiped about them, even scraped their sweat for cosmetics. But admiration didn't equal power. Gladiators lived in a strange limbo, loved by the people, dismissed by the law, celebrated yet contained. Rome understood something uncomfortable. If spectacle gets status, spectacle can replace governance, and Rome would never let a man with a helmet and trident run the state. In ancient Rome, religion wasn't a personal choice. It wasn't about what you secretly believed. It was a system to keep the city safe. And if you messed up your part with the gods, Rome didn't see it as a spiritual mistake. It was negligent endangerment. Romans treated their relationship with the gods like a business deal. Do the rituals correctly and the gods keep order. Screw it up and suddenly crops fail, fires break out, and everyone's asking, who pissed off Jupiter this time? So Rome made sure religious duties were done perfectly. Public officials had to perform sacrifices, prayers, and rituals down to the tiniest detail. The wrong word, the wrong timing, the wrong hand gesture, all could ruin it. And if it did, you repeated it immediately. Half pleasing a god was worse than doing nothing. Private citizens weren't exempt either. Promises to the gods were legally binding. Fail to deliver, and you could be fined, shamed, or punished to Rome. This wasn't superstition. It was risk management. They had no weather forecasts, no doctors predicting epidemics. If disaster struck, divine anger was the most logical explanation. And when the gods were angry, action had to be immediate. Religion also kept the population in line. Festivals, rituals, sacrifices, they created predictability. Everyone knew what was happening, and Rome didn't care what you believed privately. Belief was optional. Participation was mandatory. Public compliance mattered more than personal faith. Break that system, and panic could spread. Panic led to unrest. Unrest led to instability. And Rome hated instability. Keeping the gods happy? To Rome, that was infrastructure, not theology. In ancient Rome, words were dangerous. They could ignite riots, topple governments, and destroy cities without a single fire being set. Rome understood something modern societies often forget. One persuasive speaker in the wrong place at the wrong time could do more damage than an army. Public speech was carefully controlled. You couldn't just stand on a street corner and start addressing a crowd. Unauthorized speeches were suspicious, especially if they criticized officials, got emotional, or promised quick fixes. Rome had seen the results. Charismatic speakers stirred resentment, crowds gathered, demands escalated, riots followed. Rome preferred boredom to bloodshed. Only certain people could speak publicly: magistrates, senators, priests, or those explicitly permitted. Even then, tone mattered. Calm, measured, controlled. Shouting, emotional appeals, dangerous. If your words made people feel too much, Rome noticed. Electioneering was regulated. Large gatherings required approval. Debate was fine, but not if it turned into mob chaos. There was also a class angle. The elite were trained in rhetoric. The masses were not unrestricted speech, risked giving power to someone persuasive, but not invested in keeping order. Rome's priority: predictable influence, structured spaces, controlled speech, not hatred of ideas, fear of uncontrolled emotion. In ancient Rome, adultery wasn't private, it wasn't relationship drama, it was a public threat. Rome didn't ask, "Are you happy?" It asked, "Will this mess up inheritance and alliances for generations?" Adultery was a crime, not because Romans were Puritans, but because they were obsessed with lineage and social clarity. Who fathered which child mattered. Property, citizenship, family alliances, political power. It all depended on knowing bloodlines. An affair wasn't romance, it was uncertainty. Whose child, who inherits, which family gains power, which loses. One affair could unravel decades of planning. Men were treated differently. Affairs with enslaved people or prostitutes didn't threaten inheritance lines. Hypocritical, sure, but consistent with Roman priorities. Affairs involving married women triggered consequences. Husbands could act. Fathers could intervene. Courts got involved. This wasn't about heartbreak. It was about restoring order before chaos spread. Elite marriages were political alliances. Affairs threatened those alliances. Public punishment also served as a deterrent. Don't risk destabilizing households. Gossip and shame worked as tool. Desire wasn't criminal. Uncertainty was. In Rome, stability mattered far more than sympathy. Death was inevitable, but turning it into a spectacle, that was discouraged. Romans took funerals seriously, very seriously. Left unchecked, funerals could spiral into loud, expensive, chaotic events that destabilized everything. Funerals were public, processions, crowds, speeches, grief. Wealthy families often turned funerals into status competitions. More mourners, more musicians, more elaborate coffins, more everything. The dead weren't honored, they were props in a social battle. Rome stepped in. Laws limited spending, procession size, mourners, even how much gold could be buried. It wasn't disrespecting the dead. It was preventing grief from becoming political theater. And it was economic sense. Lavish funerals could bankrupt families. Debt led to resentment to lawsuits, and sometimes even violence. Rome wanted funerals to honor the dead, not ruin the living. Rome preferred that mournings end with tears, not lawsuits. Funerals weren't just private grief, they could spark chaos. Big funerals drew crowds. Crowds got restless. Restless crowds listened to speeches. Emotional speeches turned political. Suddenly, a funeral could become a protest. Rome had seen this happen before, and it didn't like it. So Rome limited funeral extravagance. Death had to be private, controlled, predictable. Grief was for families, not the whole city. Of course, wealthy Romans grumbled. They hated being told how to spend their money. Families bent the rules, holding funerals that were modest in name only. Rome passed new laws. Everyone pretended to follow them. But the point stayed the same. Rome didn't fear death. It feared what people did with it when given a stage. In ancient Rome, freedom came with strings attached. When a slave was freed, they didn't just stroll off into independence. They became a freedman or freedwoman, legally free but still tied to obligations to their former master, now called a patron. To modern ears, this sounds like freedom, with homework. To Rome, it was brilliantly practical. Rome relied on slavery, free too many people at once without structure, and society could spiral into chaos. Thousands of new citizens with no resources, no loyalty, no guidance. That was a recipe for disaster. The patron-client system created stable dependence. Point 7. Freed people owed loyalty, respect, and often services. Patrons offered protection, legal support, and social access. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Freed people had a place in society. Patrons gained loyal supporters who voted, campaigned, and reinforced their influence. Some freed people became wealthy, respected, and powerful, but loyalty was still expected. Rome didn't fear ambition. It feared chaotic ambition. Freedom came with obligations, not because Rome hated liberty, but because Rome knew unstructured liberty explodes. If there's one thing that defined Rome, it's this. Nothing was private. Not your clothes, your family, your love life, or even your promises to invisible gods. Personal behavior leaked into public life. Private excess became public debt. Private scandal became feud. Feud became violence. Violence became instability. Instability became civil war. And Rome had seen collapse enough to hate it with a passion. Rules weren't tyranny, they were maintenance. Rome didn't trust individuals to act in the collective interest when emotions, pride, or desire got involved. So it added rules. Many rules, probably too many rules, but rules that worked. And for centuries, Rome managed enormous populations, diverse cultures, and constant pressure, all without modern technology. Point 7. People didn't have freedom like we think of it, but they had predictability, and that kept the empire running. Rome eventually fell, of course. Rules alone can't save an empire forever, but they delayed collapse far longer than chaos ever could. So when we look back at Roman laws and think, that's insane, we're missing the point. Rome wasn't trying to be humane. Rome was trying to survival, meant limits on emotion, behavior, ambition, and sometimes joy. Rome didn't ask, is this fair? It asked, will this keep everything from falling apart? And for a long time, the answer was yes. Rome's strangest rules weren't mistakes, they were warnings. Vincent van Gogh entered the world in 1853 in the tiny Dutch village of Zundert, a place so quiet it almost amplified every inner sound. He was born exactly 1 year after a stillborn brother, also named Vincent, a fact that quietly haunted him his whole life. From early on, Vincent grew up feeling like a replacement, every Sunday walking past a gravestone with his own name. He was reminded that life was fragile accidental, and deeply symbolic. His father was a strict Protestant pastor. His mother was artistic, arranging flowers and shapes with care. From her art, he absorbed sensitivity to color and form. From his father, moral seriousness that would later turn into obsession. Vincent was not a cheerful child. Teachers called him intense, awkward, and distant. Other kids played, he watched. He observed patterns, people, and the world as if it were a puzzle no one else could see. School never fit. Social rules felt artificial. He wanted meaning, purpose, something absolute. When he spoke, he often spoke too much. When he felt too deeply. In his late teens, Vincent worked for an art dealership, Goupil and Company, selling paintings before he ever painted. At first, he was competent, but his intensity made him hard to work with. He grew contemptuous of buyers, disgusted by commerce, convinced that art was sacred, not furniture to trade. Letters to his brother Theo show a man already at war with himself. He longed to matter, to serve something higher, God, humanity, truth. He tried religion, teaching, preaching, giving away his clothes, even sleeping on the floor like a martyr in training. Each path ended the same: rejection, failure, silence. By his late 20s, he was broke, unemployed, and emotionally exhausted. But beneath the failures, something restless was sharpening. He hadn't yet picked up a brush with conviction, but the hunger was there. A need to translate inner storms into something visible. The quiet village that once confined him had unknowingly produced a man who would later make the world feel his unease. Only after exhausting nearly every other identity did he turn, almost reluctantly, to art. Painting wasn't a childhood dream. It was a refuge. At first, Vincent didn't aim to be great. He aimed to be honest. He started with peasants, laborers, worn faces, bent backs, people he understood, not socially but spiritual. He studied anatomy obsessively, filling notebooks with hands, boots, spines, skulls. His early work was dark, heavy, almost muddy, as if light itself had to fight to exist on the canvas. Beauty wasn't decorative, it was earned through endurance. During this time, his brother Theo became more than family. Theo became Vincent's lifeline, his anchor, and his unwavering support. He sent money regularly, not because he had to, but because he truly believed in Vincent. In return, Vincent sent hundreds of letters, raw, philosophical, painfully honest. They reveal a man constantly questioning his worth, his sanity, and whether suffering might be the price of seeing the world clearly. Vincent studied art in fits and starts, never quite fitting into formal school. He admired artists who painted ordinary life with dignity instead of fante. He rejected polish for truth, even if it was ugly. This approach slowed his progress and fueled his frustration. He destroyed works, started over endlessly, and criticized himself with a cruelty no teacher could match. Loneliness amplified everything. Vincent craved connection, but pushed people away just as fiercely. He fell in love recklessly, often with women who didn't return his feelings. Each rejection deepened his belief that he was fundamentally out of step with the world. Still, he painted not for joy, but because not painting felt worse. During these years, something remarkable began to emerge, not mastery, but vision. He learned to see not just surfaces, but emotional weight. Fields weren't just landscapes. Faces weren't just faces. Everything carried inner meaning. Art became survival. The real transformation began when he left the gray skies of the north for Paris. The city was loud, crowded, overwhelming, but it opened him to a revelation: color as emotion. He met impressionists who treated light not as decoration, but as a subject. Until then, his palette had been dark and earthy, shaped by coal, poverty, and moral gravity. In Paris, color burned, vibrated, and refused to be tamed. Vincent absorbed everything with manic intensity, studying brushwork, composition, and theory, while rejecting imitation. He didn't want to blend in. He wanted color to shout, bleed, and feel alive on the canvas. This period was intense. Vincent painted constantly, sometimes finishing multiple works in a week. His brushstrokes grew urgent, thick, fast. He stopped smoothing edges and attacked the canvas like it was a battlefield. Living with other artists was hard. Vincent admired them, but clashed constantly. Conversation spiraled into obsession. He drank heavily, ate little, and worked until collapse. Friends came and went, but beneath the chaos, something extraordinary was happening. He began to believe that emotion could replace realism. A field didn't have to look like a field, it had to feel like one. A night sky didn't have to be accurate, it had to convey awe, dread, longing. This belief isolated him, but it also unlocked the voice that would define him. His letters oscillated between hope and despair. One day he felt on the verge of something great. The next he was certain he was wasting his life. Success was distant, recognition non-existent. Yet his inner compass had shifted. He was no longer searching for purpose. He had found it, even if it was destroying him. By the end of this chapter, Vincent's art was unmistakably his. The storm inside him had found color, movement, rhythm. Whether the human mind behind it could survive the intensity was another question. Seeking light, warmth, and clarity, Vincent left Paris and moved south to Arles, a sun-soaked town where colors were sharp, bright, alive. Here he hoped to build something lasting, not just paintings, but a life. He rented a small house with yellow walls, modest yet full of possibility. To him, it was more than a home, it was a vision. He imagined a space where artists could create without rivalry or loneliness. The sunlight transformed his work immediately. Yellows blazed, blues deepened. Ordinary objects, chairs, sunflowers, bedrooms gained emotional weight. Vincent painted obsessively, outdoors under the sun, ignoring hunger and exhaustion. The rhythm was punishing, but the results were electric. 7. For the first time, he felt close to harmony. Then Paul Gauguin arrived. 7. Hope surged. Vincent admired him and believed their partnership could change art. At first, they worked together, talked endlessly, challenged each other, but tension simmered. Gauguin was controlled and distant. Vincent was volatile and exposed. Conversations became sharp. Criticism felt like betrayal. Vincent feared abandonment. Terrified the dream would collapse. Sleeplessness, paranoia, and emotional instability intensified. The yellow house, meant to symbolize unity, became charged with anxiety. One day, after a heated confrontation, Vincent suffered a psychological crisis and mutilated his own ear. It wasn't madness in isolation, it was prolonged strain. Isolation and inner torment Gauguin left. The dream ended. Vincent was hospitalized, confused, ashamed, devastated. The yellow house remained bright, but stripped of hope. Even in collapse, Vincent painted from hospital rooms and fleeting moments of clarity. He continued to work. Arliss gave him vivid colors and deep wounds. The dream of belonging failed, but revealed something undeniable. Vincent could not escape himself. He could only paint what lived inside him. After Arliss, Vincent voluntarily entered the asylum at St. Rem Monastery, surrounded by olive groves and stone corridors. It was meant to contain chaos, not cure it. But for Vincent, confinement brought fragile order. The world narrowed, distractions disappeared. What remained was his mind, and the window through which he could still see the sky. Life in the asylum was slow, punctuated by severe mental episodes. There were days he couldn't speak, couldn't paint, couldn't trust his thoughts. Hallucinations, confusion, fear overwhelmed him. He felt trapped inside his own mind. But between storms came calm, and in those moments he painted with extraordinary focus. The asylum garden became a primary subject. Irises, olive trees, cypresses, nature was no backdrop but emotional force. His brush strokes grew rhythmic, almost musical, swirling and pulsing with contained intensity. These were not peaceful paintings. They were controlled explosion order imposed on chaos. From his small room, he painted the view outside his barred window. The sky fascinated him, vast, alive, unreachable. During this time, he created some of his most iconic works, including night skies that seemed to breathe and twist under unseen pressure. Despite his productivity, Vincent remained deeply uncertain of his worth. He sold almost nothing. Recognition didn't come. Letters to Theo show gratitude mixed with guilt. Thankful for support, guilty for being a burden. He worried his illness made him useless, that his art was compensation, not contribution. Yet something remarkable happened. Vincent realized painting didn't require happiness, it required honesty. The asylum stripped away illusions, leaving only sensation, memory, and feeling. That was enough. Saint Remy did not heal him, but it gave him structure long enough to create work that feels timeless. Born from instability, he painted not despite suffering, but through it, moment by moment, storm by storm. After a year, Vincent was released under the care of a physician near Paris, settling in the quiet village of Auvers. On the surface, it seemed like recovery. He was closer to Theo, surrounded by countryside, inviting long walks and steady work. For the first time in years, there was a cautious sense of hope. not happiness, but the possibility of balance. Vincent painted constantly. Fields of wheat, village streets, gardens, portraits, all flowed from him with astonishing speed. Sometimes he finished a canvas in a single sitting, driven by an urgency that was both creative and unsettling. In Auvers, his style reached full maturity. Bold colors, vibrating lines, compositions that pulsed with nervous energy. Point 7. The landscapes were alive yet uneasy. Skies pressed down, fields seemed restless. No matter how many paintings he made, his inner world remained fragile. Vincent knew his fragile stability depended on others, especially Theo I. When Theo struggled financially or emotionally, Vincent felt the ground shift beneath him. He worried he was a burden, an obligation that could never end. Success still refused to arrive. A few critics noticed his work, but recognition was distant and abstract. It brought no security. Letters from this time reveal a man trapped between hope and dread. One moment he spoke of future plans, new techniques, belief that his work might finally matter. The next he feared his illness would return, that his mind would betray him again. Calm was temporary, borrowed, fragile. He also felt profoundly alone. Surrounded by nature and people, he remained emotionally isolated, unable to rest. The very intensity that fueled his art made ordinary life exhausting. The countryside reflected this tension, beautiful, open, alive, but charged with unease. He didn't paint peaceful fields. He painted fields under pressure, skies in motion, paths that seemed to lead nowhere. These paintings were confessions, not landscapes. Work held him together, but shadows remained, patient, waiting, growing heavier. Summer in Auvers followed a quiet, ritualistic rhythm. Each morning he walked into the fields with easel and paints, returning hours later sunburned, exhausted, silent. To outsiders he seemed disciplined, calm, but for Vincent, silence was heavy, pressing inward. Painting remained his anchor, but no longer relief, only postponement. Each finished canvas brought order for a moment, then the question, and then what? His productivity became necessity. Stopping would allow the darkness to surface. Theo's health, his job, his family, all weighed heavily on Vincent. He feared being a burden to the one person who believed in him. He wrote with mounting anxiety, apologizing for being alive, for costing money, for needing care. Praise arrived too late, too softly. He didn't see himself as a misunderstood genius. He saw himself as unfinished, unstable, unresolved. His paintings from this time grew darker, though still intense. Colors remained bold, but harmony dissolved. Crows crossed restless skies, paths split and vanished, horizons tilted, never offering rest. These works hung between motion and collapse, as if the land itself mirrored his unease. Vincent spoke little of the future. Plans dissolved into vague possibilities. What remained was exhaustion, mental, emotional, physical. Years of struggle had left him quietly worn. No dramatic breaking point, just accumulation. The countryside that once promised calm now felt indifferent. Open spaces emphasized isolation. Intensity demands energy, and his was nearly gone. This chapter was defined not by chaos, but by heaviness. A man still working, still seeing, still creating, yet carrying a silence too dense to escape. In late July 1890, Vincent's life narrowed to its fragile final shape. The days were warm, the wheat fields tall and restless under the wind. Outwardly, nothing dramatic announced the end. He continued his routine walking, painting, returning to his room, but something inside had quietly reached its limit. One afternoon, Vincent walked into the fields alone. His tools in hand, painting no longer felt enough. What followed was not madness, but a tired, deliberate decision. A man negotiating with pain for years. He shot himself in the chest. The wound wasn't immediately fatal. Remarkably, he managed to walk back to his lodging. He collapsed onto his bed, bleeding, conscious, calm. When questioned, he spoke little. No anger, no dramatic explanation, only acceptance. Theo was summoned. He arrived to find his brother weakened. Lucid, over 2 days they spoke quietly. Vincent expressed no regret. Instead, he spoke with clarity, even relief. He told Theo the sadness would never end. After years of living with intensity and a world demanding moderation, he was exhausted. Theo stayed by his side as Vincent faded. On the morning of July 29, 1890, Vincent van Gogh died at 37 too. His final moments were subdued, intimate, devastatingly human. The funeral was modest, attended by a handful of mourners. His coffin was covered with sunflowers, the same flowers he had painted with devotion. His paintings, now priceless, were stacked casually against walls. To the world, his death barely registered. For Theo, it was unbearable. He lost not just a brother, but a purpose. Within months, Theo's health collapsed, and he died never witnessing the recognition that would come. Vincent's final act was not defiance, it was acknowledgement of limits. He had given everything, mind, body, peace, to make inner truth visible. When nothing remained, he stopped. The fields remained. The paintings remained. Vincent did not. At his death, he left no wealth, no fame, no victory. His paintings were unsold, his name obscure. Yet in death, his work spoke freely, without interruption. Theo's widow, Johanna, preserved his letters, organized his paintings, believing fiercely the world had simply arrived too early for him. Exhibitions followed. Critics returned. They found not chaos, but intention, not madness, but precision. Vincent painted not how things looked, but how they felt. And feeling, unlike fashion, does not expire. Over time, Van Gogh became a symbol for the misunderstood, the sensitive, the relentless. His life story was simplified into myth. The tortured genius, the ear, the madness, but his work resisted reduction. Each painting remained disciplined, deliberate, and controlled. Suffering did not create it. Commitment did. Ironically, the recognition Vincent longed for came too late. His works became some of the most valuable and revered in history. Museums filled, books multiplied. Yet this success carries quiet cruelty. The validation arrived when it no longer mattered to him. What endures is the honesty. Vincent never painted to impress. He painted to survive. He gave form to emotions most people struggle to name: longing, despair, hope. The unbearable intensity of being alive. That is why his work still feels immediate, still feels close. Vincent van Gogh did not find peace in life, but he left a language for those still searching. His legacy is not that suffering produces greatness, but that truth pursued without compromise leaves a mark that outlives the one who made it. The man faded quietly into history, but the sound he helped shape only grew louder with every generation. Long before jazz had a name, before it had rules, before anyone tried to write it down or argue about it, New Orleans was already creating it. This was never a city that waited for culture to arrive. It pulled everything in, mixed it together, and transformed it under pressure. Sound filled the air, not as entertainment, but as atmosphere. Music was everywhere, as natural as the heavy southern heat. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans was unlike any other city in America. French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and American influences lived side by side, without fully blending. Languages overlapped, religions crossed paths, traditions collided every single day. What came out of this was not polite harmony, but friction, and friction creates heat. Heat creates movement. Music here did not belong to concert halls or quiet rooms. It lived outside. Brass bands marched through neighborhoods for weddings, funerals, and parades, sometimes all in the same week. Churches echoed with hymns shaped by African call and response. The docks rang with work songs. Dance halls throbbed with rhythm deep into the night. There was no clean line between sacred and secular. Everything fed into everything else. One of the most powerful places was Congo Square, where enslaved and formerly enslaved Black people gathered on Sundays. They danced, they drummed, they held on to rhythms that were never meant to survive. These gatherings were not performances, they were memory made sound. Rhythm passed from body to body, generation to generation, even after language and homeland were taken away. At the same time, European traditions brought structure, harmony, notation. Point 7, marching bands played tight arrangements. Opera houses staged grand productions. Classically trained musicians lived just blocks away from players who learned everything by ear. In New Orleans, these worlds didn't stay separate. They listened to each other. And the city didn't demand purity. Point 7. You were allowed to borrow, bend, twist, and recombine. Mistakes weren't punished. Improvisation wasn't failure. It was expected. Music wasn't something you perfected. It was something you did. Jazz didn't begin as a rebellion or a statement. It rose quietly from this environment, the way humidity rises from warm ground. New Orleans didn't invent jazz on purpose. It simply made it unavoidable. The heart of jazz was shaped long before the first trumpet bent a note. Its earliest pulse came from people who had everything taken from them. Except rhythm, enslaved Africans carried musical traditions that could not be erased, complex rhythms, call and response, movement tied directly to sound. Even under oppression, music survived by adapting. Sometimes it grew quieter, sometimes it became communal. Most of all, it became emotional truth made audible. In New Orleans, pain was never silent. Work songs rose from docks and fields, keeping time while expressing exhaustion and strength. Spirituals carried grief upward, blending African memory with Christian imagery. These songs weren't meant to impress, they were meant to hold people together. Rhythm became structure. Repetition became comfort. Unlike much of the country, New Orleans allowed these traditions to exist openly. Black musicians played publicly in parades, funerals, celebrations. Music followed people from birth to death. Funerals became journeys, slow and mournful on the way to the grave, then joyful and defiant on the way back. Death didn't end the music, it sharpened it. The blues began forming here too, not as a genre, but as a language of feeling. Bent notes, strained voices, unresolved tension expressed what words could not pain, wasn't hidden. It was shaped, stretched, and released. That emotional honesty would become central to jazz. Nothing stood still. Musicians listened constantly to European harmony, drifting from opera houses to Caribbean rhythms arriving through the port. They borrowed freely. A hymn became a dance tune. A march loosened and came alive. Time softened. Space opened between beats. Music began to breathe. Improvisation grew naturally. When life itself was uncertain, rigid repetition made no sense. Musicians learned to respond in the moment, to the crowd, to each other, to emotion. This wasn't chaos, it was conversation. By the late 1800s, something new was clearly forming. It didn't yet have a name, but it had a feeling. Rhythms that swung, melodies that bent. Music that could hold sorrow and joy at the same time. Jazz wasn't born from happiness, it was born from survival. As the century ended, recognizable voices began to emerge. These weren't polished composers or perfectionists. They were working men, laborers, barbers, dock workers, who played because music was part of daily life. Among them was a near legend, Buddy Bolden. Bolden left no recordings, but his influence echoed everywhere. He wasn't known for precision, he was known for power. He played loud, emotional, and free-bending notes, stretching rhythm, pouring feeling into structured music. People said his sound felt dangerous, unpredictable, alive. Con 7. He played what people felt but couldn't say. Around musicians like him, melodies stopped being fixed. A tune became something flexible. One instrument stated an idea, another answered, a third commented. This collective improvisation wasn't planned chaos, it was instinctive cooperation. Everyone listened, everyone responded. Much of this music flowed through Storyville, the city's legalized red light district. It was condemned morally, but essential culturally. Bars, brothels, and dance halls needed music every night, and they paid for it. Musicians learned fast how to read a room, shift moods, and hold attention. If people wanted fire, they delivered fire. If they wanted sorrow, they slowed the air itself. Race shaped the sound in complicated ways. Creole musicians often had formal training and could read music. Black musicians often learned by ear, focusing on rhythm and feel. When segregation laws forced these groups together, their styles collided. Technique met intuition, structure met swing. The result wasn't compromise, it was expansion. Instruments found new roles. Cornets led, clarinets curled around melodies, trombones growled underneath, rhythm sections loosened time. Music no longer marched, it swayed point seven. It was something entirely new. By the early 1900s, the sound crossed a line. It still had no official name, but it was undeniable. Jazz had stepped forward and found its first voices. And then came Louis Armstrong. If early jazz was a conversation, Armstrong changed the language. Born into deep poverty in New Orleans, his childhood was shaped by hunger, violence, and instability. Music wasn't a dream, it was survival. After a troubled incident as a boy, he was sent to a reform home where he learned the cornet. What began as discipline became destiny. Armstrong absorbed the city's sound like a native language. He listened constantly to street parades, brass bands, older musicians who taught by example, not explanation. From the beginning, his playing stood apart, where others blended into the group. Armstrong's horn spoke. His tone was bold, clear, and emotionally direct. You could recognize it instantly. Jazz before Armstrong focused on the group. Everyone played together. Armstrong didn't destroy that tradition. He transformed it. He brought the individual forward. His solos weren't decoration, they were statements, stories told with confidence, warmth, and authority. When Armstrong played, time seemed to shift around him. His sense of rhythm was revolutionary. He didn't follow the beat. He leaned into it, stretched it, danced with it. This created what musicians later called swing, a feeling impossible to write down, but impossible to miss. Jazz stopped marching. It started breathing. His influence spread fast. Other musicians adjusted, giving solos more space, more meaning. Bands reorganized themselves around voices, not just parts. Jazz slowly began to shift. It moved from many voices blending together toward individual voices standing out, without ever losing its sense of community. Louis Armstrong played a huge role in that change. He didn't just transform the horn, he changed singing too. His rough, gravelly voice, playful timing, and spontaneous scat singing treated the human voice like just another instrument. Singing was no longer about being perfect or polished. It was about feeling, about truth, about expression. What Armstrong truly represented was possibility. He proved that jazz could show personality without losing its soul, that it could have structure without becoming stiff. Through him, jazz stepped onto a bigger stage, not by leaving its roots behind, but by making them louder and clearer. New Orleans gave jazz its foundation. Point 7 Armstrong gave it a spine and a face the world would never forget. As jazz grew stronger, New Orleans could no longer hold it. Economic pressure, racial violence, and harsh segregation pushed thousands of black families north. During the Great Migration, musicians moved too, carrying jazz with them like a passport. Jazz didn't abandon New Orleans, it carried the city inside it, stored in memory, rhythm, and attitude. Chicago was one of the first major stops. There, jazz found crowded clubs, louder rooms, and longer nights. The music changed to fit its new surroundings. Group improvisation slowly gave way to sharper, more focused solos. Bands tightened up, tempos sped up, city life demanded urgency, and jazz answered. What once floated through open streets now echoed off brick walls and through smoky rooms. Then came New York, especially Harlem. Here jazz met ambition at full force. It entered ballrooms, theaters, and recording studios. It learned how to project. It learned how to survive in business without giving up its heart. Musicians competed, collaborated, and pushed each other constantly. Jazz became both art and livelihood, shaped by rent payments, reputation, and racial limits. Recording technology changed everything. For the first time, jazz could travel without the musicians themselves. Records captured moments of improvisation and replayed them endlessly. Styles spread faster, but something was lost too. Jazz lived on spontaneity. Fame now demanded consistency. Musicians had to walk a tightrope between freedom and repetition. Still, the spirit of New Orleans never disappeared. Even as arrangements grew more complex, jazz stayed emotionally direct. Wherever jazz landed, it absorbed new ideas and reshaped them, just as it had from the beginning. New Orleans released jazz into the world tested. The world tested. Jazz survived by changing without forgetting where it first learned how to breathe. As jazz settled into northern cities, it entered a new phase, one marked by confidence, scale, and self-awareness. It was no longer a regional sound looking for approval. It knew what it was. Nowhere was this more visible than Harlem. Point 7, where jazz became deeply tied to identity, pride, and modern black expression. Dance halls and ballrooms grew larger. Big bands replaced smaller groups, not to tame jazz, but to make it bigger. Arrangements became more detailed, balancing tight structure with moments of freedom. Jazz wasn't giving up improvisation. It was learning how to fill space. At the center of this shift stood Duke Ellington. He didn't treat jazz as raw material that needed polishing. He treated it as already valuable. His music was rich, dramatic, and deeply rooted in black tradition. He wrote for specific musicians, shaping sound around personality, not forcing everyone into the same role. Under Ellington, jazz became orchestral without losing intimacy. His work proved jazz could be complex without becoming cold, elegant without losing grit. It could sit on grand stages and still speak honestly about real life. This changed how people listened. Jazz was no longer only for dancing. It was something to hear, to absorb. At the same time, singers were reshaping jazz from the inside. Vocalists treated phrasing like improvisation, bending time and melody to tell personal stories. Lyrics became more confessional. Jazz made space for vulnerability without apology. But success brought pressure. As jazz grew popular, clubs demanded reliability. Radio wanted familiarity. Musicians struggled to stay creative in systems that rewarded repetition. Some adapted, some pushed back. That tension between innovation and acceptance became part of jazz itself. Still, the core survived. Jazz remained music of the moment, shaped by who was in the room and what they felt. It rewarded listening, risk, and response. This era marked jazz's coronation. It had arrived confident, complex, and fully aware of itself. But the future would test it even more, and almost immediately jazz began questioning its own crown. By the late 1930s and early 40s, younger musicians felt trapped. Swing was popular. Swing was profitable. And to them, it was becoming safe. So jazz did what it had always done when boxed in. It broke its own rules. After hours, in small clubs and back rooms, musicians experimented. Tempo sped up, harmonies twisted, melody shattered and reformed. This wasn't music for dancing. It demanded attention. It demanded effort. Jazz was sharpening its edge again. Musicians like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie led this shift into bebop. Improvisation became fast, intense, and intellectually demanding. Solos weren't just expressive, they were confrontational. Jazz stopped explaining itself. This wasn't arrogance, it was self-defense. Bebop musicians refused to exist only for entertainment. They wanted control. They wanted to play for each other. Jazz returned to its roots as conversation, but now the conversation was fast, dense, and unapologetic. At the same time, jazz continued to speak softly too. Singers like Billie Holiday stripped songs down to pure emotion. Her voice carried pain, resilience, and lived truth with heartbreaking clarity. Jazz proved it could be complex and vulnerable at once. These two paths, explosive experimentation and quiet confession, didn't divide jazz, they expanded it. The music refused to be one thing. Critics argued, audiences split. Some claimed jazz was dying. In truth, it was shedding skin. Jazz never promised comfort. It promised honesty, even when honesty was hard to hear. By breaking its own structure, jazz stayed alive. The rules were never the point. Expression was seven. As long as musicians were willing to risk being misunderstood in pursuit of truth, jazz would keep breathing. By the mid-20th century, jazz no longer moved in a single direction. It multiplied, it explored. Some feared this meant it was losing focus. In reality, it meant freedom. One of the defining figures of this era was Miles Davis, a musician not known for one sound, but for constant reinvention. Miles understood something vital. Jazz survives by taking risks. Over decades, he stripped the music down, slowed it, electrified it, and rebuilt it again. Each phase confused people. Each phase opened new doors. Alongside him, John Coltrane pushed jazz inward, searching relentlessly for meaning. His playing turned improvisation into a spiritual quest. Notes surged like a flood, then slowly faded into silence. For Coltrane, music was not just sound, it was devotion, not only to faith, but to truth itself. Through jazz, he searched for something higher, something beyond words. Jazz became a path toward transcendence. Around him, other musicians were also pushing outward. Some explored space and texture. Some abandoned traditional harmony altogether. Others blended jazz with funk, rock, and sounds from around the world. Purists complained. Innovators kept moving forward. Jazz had always absorbed what surrounded it. Now the surroundings were global. What tied these different paths together was not a single style, but a shared way of working. Jazz still depended on listening, response, and presence. Musicians met each other in real time, shaping sound in the moment. Uncertainty was not a flaw, it was part of the creation. Even the most experimental jazz was still a conversation. Jazz also became a language of resistance. In a world shaped by segregation, political tension, and social unrest, improvisation carried meaning. To play freely was to claim humanity. To bend structure was to question power. Jazz did not shout slogans. It resisted through form. By this point, jazz could no longer be tied to one place. It belonged to New Orleans, Chicago, Harlem, and anywhere musicians dared to claim it. Its roots were still audible, but its future was wide open. Jazz became less about a specific sound and more about an approach, a way of thinking, a way of meeting pressure with creativity instead of collapse. The road ahead was never meant to be neat or unified. Unity was never jazz's promise. Its promise was motion, restless, searching, alive. Jazz began in a specific place, among specific people, under specific pressures, but it was never meant to belong to just one era. What kept it alive was not nostalgia, money, or institutional approval. It survived because it answered something permanent in human nature, the need to express what cannot be neatly said. By the late 20th century, jazz was declared dead again and again. It no longer ruled the radio. It no longer shaped popular dance culture. Younger audiences moved on to louder, simpler sounds. But jazz did not disappear. It went underground, into small clubs, into classrooms, into private rooms where musicians gathered for the same reason they always had, to listen and respond. What endured was the method. Jazz remained a discipline of attention. Players showed up without knowing exactly what would happen. They trusted each other enough to fail in public. This was not nostalgia for an old sound. It was loyalty to a way of being. Around the world, musicians reshaped jazz through their own histories. In Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America, local rhythms blended naturally with improvisation. Jazz proved it could adapt without losing itself. It did not demand imitation. It invited dialogue. Schools preserved technique, but living jazz resisted containment. The music never truly belonged to institutions. It belonged to late nights, imperfect rooms, and people willing to stay present. Wherever that mindset existed, jazz lived, even if it no longer sounded like New Orleans, Harlem, or Chicago. Most importantly, jazz never forgot its origin. At its core was the transformation of pressure into expression, sorrow into rhythm, constraint into movement. That thread connected modern players back to Congo Square, to funerals that danced, to horns answering grief with sound. Jazz never promised comfort, it promised honesty. It asked musicians and listeners to stay awake, to hold complexity without simplifying it away. That demand kept it alive. Jazz was never born in a single moment. It was a pattern, one that continues whenever someone listens deeply, responds truthfully, and refuses silence. This tax was not an accident. It was planned carefully and deliberately by Alexander Hamilton as part of a bigger vision for the new nation. The United States was buried in debt from the Revolutionary War. Its credit was weak. Its future was uncertain. Hamilton believed the country's survival depended on one critical proof: that the federal government could raise money and enforce its own laws. To Hamilton, taxing distilled spirits made sense. Whiskey was everywhere. It was easy to track and already part of everyday trade. Taxing it would bring in revenue and, just as importantly, send a message. Laws passed by Congress were not suggestions, they were commands. But what looked orderly on paper collided hard with life on the frontier. The tax favored large Eastern distillers who produced in bulk and could afford flat fees. Small Western farmers who distilled seasonally and sold locally paid more per gallon and suffered the most. Equality under the law existed in theory, not in effect. Enforcement only deepened the anger. Federal tax collectors arrived as symbols of intrusion. They demanded registration, detailed records, and cash payments, things frontier communities struggled to provide. Compliance felt humiliating. Resistance felt reasonable. At first, opposition was restrained. Farmers wrote petitions. They complained. They asked for changes. When nothing came of it, frustration hardened. Tax collectors were harassed, threatened, and publicly shamed. Some were tarred and feathered. Others quit. Courts were disrupted. Federal authority was openly mocked. To the rebels, this was not chaos, it was defense. They believed they were protecting the spirit of the revolution, resisting unfair taxes imposed without true representation. In their minds, Hamilton was rebuilding the centralized power Americans had fought to escape. To Hamilton, this resistance was a direct threat to the Republic's survival. If the government backed down, it would signal weakness. Other regions would follow. Laws would become optional. The nation would fracture before it had time to hold together. The whiskey tax became more than a financial policy. It became a test of federal power itself. Could the government compel obedience, or would it remain a loose association, strong only on paper? Hamilton was determined to find the answer. The confrontation he pushed toward was not reckless. It was calculated, and once protests crossed into defiance, there would be no turning back. The nation was about to learn whether authority could reach west of the mountains. By 1793, resistance in western Pennsylvania had moved beyond complaint. Meetings were held in taverns and fields. Committees formed, words sharpened. The belief that the tax was illegitimate spread faster than federal notices ever could. Tax collectors became targets. Some were chased away. Others were assaulted, stripped, and humiliated. Court summons were ignored. When officials tried to serve warrants, crowds blocked them. The law was no longer being debated. It was being challenged. The breaking point came in the summer of 1794. Federal Marshal David Lennox attempted to serve warrants on tax resistors. He was met by armed men, gunfire, and open threats. Soon after, the home of Tax Inspector John Neville was attacked and burned. Shots were fired. A man was killed. The line had been crossed. Rumors raced ahead of facts. Some rebels openly talked about breaking away from federal authority. Liberty poles were raised, echoing the symbols of the revolution. To them, this was a continuation of the fight against tyranny. They believed the government had chosen Eastern elites and financial interests over frontier survival. Whatever he decided would define the limits of federal power. Negotiation came first. Commissioners were sent west. Amnesty was offered to those who would comply. Some accepted. Many did not. Defiance remained loud, organized, and visible. The question was now unavoidable. Could the United States survive if laws applied only when convenient? Or would enforcement, however unpopular, prove that the government was real? In Philadelphia, leaders watched with growing alarm. This was no longer about taxes. It was about sovereignty. If armed resistance could cancel federal law, then the Constitution meant nothing when tested. President George Washington faced an impossible choice. He was the hero of the Revolution, a symbol of restraint and unity, but he was also the head of a government that had never enforced its authority by force. The answer would not come from speeches or letters. It would come from boots on the ground. For the first time in American history, the federal government chose to enforce its authority with armed force against its own citizens. The man overseeing that decision was the same one who had once led a rebellion against empire, George Washington himself. Washington acted carefully but firmly. He knew the risk. Sending troops against farmers could confirm fears that the new government was just a softer version of the old one. But allowing armed defiance to stand posed an even greater danger. If violence could cancel law, the republic would collapse before it could mature. After exhausting negotiations and issuing repeated warnings, Washington called up state militias. Thousands of troops assembled from multiple states, forming a force larger than any he had personally commanded since the Revolution. The message was clear: the government would not negotiate with insurrection. Then Washington made an extraordinary decision. He did not stay behind. He rode west himself, the only sitting U.S. president to ever lead troops in the field. This was not symbolism, it was legitimacy in motion. Federal authority was not arriving through distant paperwork, it was arriving in person. As the militia advanced toward western Pennsylvania, resistance collapsed. The size of the force stunned the rebels. Many fled, others swore loyalty. The feared battle never came. There were no dramatic clashes, no heroic last stands. Authority arrived not with chaos, but with certainty. Arrests followed, though few. 2 men were convicted of treason and later pardoned. Washington wanted enforcement, not revenge. The lesson was delivered without bloodshed. This moment reshaped the meaning of power in the United States. The federal government proved it could act decisively without becoming tyrannical. Authority did not require cruelty, but it did require resolve. The rebellion ended quietly, and in that quiet was a new reality. Laws passed by Congress would be enforced, even when unpopular, even when resisted. The Republic took its first real step from fragile experiment toward functioning nation. When the militias withdrew, there were no parades, no celebrations, only an uneasy calm. On paper, the government had won. The tax remained. Armed resistance had failed. The Constitution had been enforced. For leaders in Philadelphia, the outcome was proof the system worked. On the frontier, the feeling was different. Many farmers complied not because they were convinced, but because resistance now seemed impossible. Power had been settled, fairness had not. Resentment did not disappear, it withdrew. The rebellion revealed both the strength of federal authority and the fragility of public trust. A government could enforce obedience. Legitimacy required something more. A belief that laws reflected real life, not just financial logic. Politically, the episode deepened divisions already forming in the young nation. Supporters of strong central power saw stability, others saw warning. Critics saw the Whiskey Rebellion as a warning sign. To them, it showed how concentrated power could turn against ordinary people. Over time, the rebellion became a symbol used by both sides, each claiming it proved their argument. President George Washington understood this tension better than anyone. When he chose to pardon the convicted rebels, it was not weakness, it was caution. He wanted the moment to end, not to turn the rebels into martyrs. Force had made the government's authority clear. Mercy would help the country heal and move forward. The whiskey tax itself remained deeply unpopular. While compliance increased, acceptance never followed. Enforcing the tax continued to be difficult. Eventually, political winds shifted. Under a new administration, the tax was repealed, not because the rebellion succeeded, but because resistance exposed how impractical the policy truly was. That distinction matters. It was a tense dialogue, carried out through pressure, force, and eventual adjustment. Authority was asserted and then refined. The rebellion failed in its immediate goal, but it succeeded in something quieter and more lasting. It forced the young republic to confront the gap between policy and people. long after the militias returned home. The real impact of the rebellion continued to unfold. What mattered most was not the tax itself or the few arrests, but the precedent now woven into American political life. For the first time, the federal government had clearly shown it possessed both the legal right and the practical ability to enforce its laws within the states. That was new. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had depended on voluntary cooperation. The rebellion proved the Constitution had changed that balance. The United States was no longer a loose agreement. It was a sovereign nation with real authority. Future leaders would remember this. Whenever resistance arose over tariffs, civil rights, labor, or federal policy, the Whiskey Rebellion stood as the first example of how federal power could be enforced without collapsing into dictatorship. It quietly shaped decisions for generations, but the precedent cut both ways. If the government could enforce unpopular laws by force, it also carried the responsibility to use that power carefully. The rebellion revealed a truth that would echo through American history. Legitimacy cannot be imposed forever. It must be maintained. The conflict also accelerated the formation of political factions. Arguments over the rebellion hardened divisions between those who supported strong central authority and those who feared it. These disagreements soon evolved into the nation's first political parties. Conflict moved away from violence and into politics. Dissent did not disappear, it changed form. Protests left the fields and taverns and entered newspapers, elections, and legislatures. That shift may have been the rebellion's most lasting contribution. Ironically, the farmers who lost the confrontation helped shape the future more than they realized. Their resistance exposed the dangers of governing from theory alone, disconnected from lived experience. Federal power survived, but it learned it could not operate in isolation from the people it ruled. The rebellion proved the United States would not fall apart at the first sign of internal conflict. But it also showed that unity would always require negotiation, compromise, and restraint, not authority alone. In the years that followed, the immediate threat faded, but the lesson remained. The whiskey tax stayed on the books, yet enforcement never fully recovered. Collection was uneven. Compliance was reluctant. The message was clear. Authority could force obedience, but it could not create consent. That realization shaped the next chapter. When Thomas Jefferson became president, he inherited both the power Washington had proven and the resentment that power had stirred. Jefferson opposed the whiskey tax on both principle and practicality. He saw it as unnecessary, unfair, and damaging to trust. In 1802, the tax was repealed, not as a reward for rebellion, but as a recalibration of governance. This repeal did not undo the precedent of enforcement. It refined it. The government had shown it could act decisively. Now it showed it could listen. That balance, strength followed by restraint, became a model for resolving internal conflict without returning to violence. Public memory of the rebellion evolved. To some, it remained a warning against overreach. To others, it proved the Constitution worked. In textbooks and speeches, it became a turning point, the first time the federal government tested itself against armed resistance and survived. The drama was not in bloodshed, but in restraint after strength. For frontier communities, daily life continued. Distilling went on. Barter remained common. The distance from the capital never disappeared, but it softened. The government now felt real, not just an idea, but a presence that could arrive and then withdraw. Politically, Americans learned something crucial. Protest had power when it moved through elections and institutions, not rifles. Newspapers replaced liberty poles. Campaigns replaced armed committees. Conflict did not end, but it found a new arena. Perhaps the rebellion's deepest legacy was psychological. The nation had faced itself and chosen cohesion over collapse. It tested the line between liberty and law, and learned neither could survive alone. Power needed limits. Dissent needed channels. The Whiskey Rebellion ended quietly, but it left behind a durable grammar for American governance. When to assert authority, when to ease it, and why legitimacy matters more than victory. The rebellion is often remembered for its spectacle. Farmers in revolt, militias on the march, a president riding west. But its true importance lies deeper. It revealed the nature of the American experiment at its most fragile moment. This was not just a tax dispute. It was the first time the United States had to decide what kind of nation it would be. Two revolutionary ideas collided. Liberty, the belief that government must stay close to the people, and authority, the belief that laws once made must apply to everyone. Neither could fully retreat. What made the moment extraordinary was how narrowly catastrophe was avoided. The government enforced the law without terror. The rebels resisted loudly without tearing the nation apart. No state seceded. No foreign powers intervened. The republic bent, but it did not break. For Washington, the lesson was clear. Civilian government, not mobs or generals, would rule. His restraint after victory mattered as much as his resolve before it. Power was shown, then deliberately lowered. For ordinary Americans, another truth became clear. Independence had not erased government power. It had simply moved it closer. The real question now was how that power would be used, challenged, and corrected. That realization marked the nation's political adult. The Whiskey Rebellion did not create heroes, it created precedent. It proved that internal conflict could be survived without revolution, that disagreement could harden, then return to politics, that the Constitution was neither self-enforcing nor empty. In the centuries that followed, Americans would continue to argue over federal power, taxes, and resistance. And each time, the shadow of the Whiskey Rebellion lingered, a reminder that the nation had faced this tension before, early and untested, and had chosen continuity over collapse. The rebellion failed as an uprising, but it succeeded as a test, and by passing that test, the United States proved for the first time that it was more than a revolution already finished.